All right. No, we got all the way from Pennsylvania. All right, it's great to see everybody. And it feels like it's almost been a year since I've last seen you. Um, but all jokes aside, it's great to be in a new year. And obviously you've all taken upon yourselves for this new year to show up to a Tanya class. So let's enjoy a Tanya class for the new year, and it should bring us good blessings and all good things for the upcoming year. I'm going to start off with a joke. It's not really a joke. I've said it a couple times, and it's to bring out a point that we're going to discuss in the class. And the joke is like this. I've said it before. How do you get a philosophy student away from your front door? And the answer is, you tell him to drop off the pizza and go back to the store. Okay. Now it's more of a serious joke, but the point is, obviously, right? Philosophy students don't make a lot of money. In life, there are different types of people. There are intellectuals. Intellectuals aren't necessarily paid good money. It's very hard actually to make a living off of being a scholar. I've had a discussion with actually scholars, Jewish scholars as well. How do you make the money off of being very smart? In other words, being wise, being the person that people come to ask questions. It's not so easy. Then there are people that are very emotional. And then there are people that are very action-oriented. So we have all these different types of people. And we all, I think if you were to look at yourself, you might as well see in yourself, you may fall more into one of the categories than the other. Why am I mentioning this? Because as we've discovered in the Tanya, all three of these levels are important. The mind, the intellect, the heart, the emotions, and the action. What is more important? Well, obviously, everybody says, as we've discussed in the Tanya many times, well, you got to do the deed. But the deed alone is, first of all, not the entire story, because we're commanded to love God, but also it's very hard to maintain love without any feelings. So in today's chapter, we are going to discover how the godly soul operates. We've discussed it in other chapters of Tanya, but it's important to go over it again and again because it's really the basis of the Tanya. And I keep saying this because for so many Jewish people, the focus is on the action. And as we're going to show that action is not enough. Action alone is not enough, not because action is bad, but it's just not enough, right? It's good, right? As the old saying in Yiddish goes, if good is good, better is better, okay? In addition to that, as we have discovered in the Tanya, there's a war going on between a godly soul and an animalistic soul. And if your godly soul is only appearing in your action, in the action of your life, and not in your intellect and your emotions, then that's highly unsustainable because ultimately at some point, your animalistic soul is going to, by virtue of running your emotions and your intellect, is going to rule over your actions as well. Okay? So just doing the right actions alone is not going to be a long-term success mission. It's an interesting thing also when we discuss, actions versus emotions versus intellect. There are many people that also come to Judaism from all these different aspects, right? Some people come to Judaism through action. Maybe they were stopped on the street. Someone asked them, do you want to do a mitzvah? Or do you want a piece of matzah? That was the catalyst for their Judaism. Some people come to Judaism because of the feelings they had as children. Some people come because they went to a class or a lecture that inspired them. We all come to Judaism in different ways. And none of them are wrong. They're all good. But once we're in Judaism, we actually want to be able to have all three. And not only do we want to have all three, but all three go in an important order for the godly soul. It starts with a mind that awakens your heart, that awakens your action. And as I said in the text before this class, this is why it's called Chabad. Many people know the name Chabad. People don't realize, I always like to say Chabad is not just a movement, it's a philosophy. I say that it's both, right? It's both. Chabad is a philosophy and a movement. It's not one or the other, it's both. There's the philosophy, which you're actually studying here in the Tanya, and it's a movement. And they're kind of if you want, you could stay separate if you want. You can study Chabad philosophy and not be part of the quote unquote movement, right? Which is fine. You can study the philosophy. You can be a visionist and study Chabad philosophy. That's okay. Chabad philosophy is based on this idea that we are actually going to read today, and it comes out in the Tanya a couple times, that the key to everything is to start off with the intellect, go to the emotions, go to the action. Why? He's going to explain. It's not just because that's how the godly soul works. And of course, if we want the godly soul to win the war, we have to follow the keys of the godly soul. So let me just discuss the word Chabad as we've discussed many times. What does Chabad actually mean? Chabad itself is Chachma Bina Das, wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. And to explain more deeply, wisdom means this is the wisdom. So for example, let's say your wisdom tells you, the creator is God. Then you use your understanding to understand that concept. You look at the world, you look at the cells within the world, you know, where do things come from, whatever arguments you go through, you get to the understanding. Nevertheless, even if you have the wisdom and the understanding without knowledge, which that is the knowledge that really connects with you, and connects with your emotions, then it's going to remain in theory. Right? Well, what's that other joke? The joke goes, there was once a professor who taught child psychology, and one day he was walking by a sidewalk that had just been paved, and there were children jumping in the sidewalk, and creating their foot and their imprints in the sidewalk, which is very they're ruining the sidewalk. So this professor of child psychology starts screaming at the children, like unbelievable, like you've never heard before, screaming at the children, the top of his lungs, horrible, nasty things. So people came up to him after, they said, "We don't understand. You're a professor of psychology of children. We thought you loved children." He says, "Listen, I love children in theory, not in the concrete." Okay, all right. So sorry for that one, but this is the idea: is that so some things can remain in the theory and not in the concrete, and that is why you need to have that das, the knowledge which bridges the gap between the theory and the concrete. Now, in addition to that, it's important that it comes to our emotions. Because as I said before, and as we've been discussing this, Tanya, this is why it's so important to understand that there's a war going on. In other words, when we understand there's two parts of you, there's a godly soul and an animalistic soul. That's why it's so important that you need to fill up all parts of your body with godliness. Because if you leave a void, that allows something else to come in. Okay? Like the old thing, right? It says, don't think about the pink elephant. Well, you'll think about the pink elephant. If you're thinking about something else, you will not think about the pink elephant, right? In other words, if you leave a void, the pink elephant's going to fill it. If you really don't want to think about the pink elephant, you got to think about a purple elephant or a green elephant, right? Then you can avoid thinking about the purple elephant. So similarly, even though God is an intellectual concept, let's say, if I just leave my knowledge of God to my intellect and I don't allow it to permeate my emotions and to trickle down to my emotions, well, the moment I see chocolate cake is going to overtake my emotions, and all the theory that I have is not going to help me, and I'm not going to do things that serve God. So you have to fill your emotions with feelings towards God. And in fact, this is in the Tanya, in the Shema. We say you should love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. You got to love God with your heart. If you don't love God with your heart, your heart is gonna get filled up with other emotions, and automatically your actions will be pulled towards those emotions. So in short, we have a 3-step process. We need to think about God, because God is not natural to us, right? Chocolate, as I mentioned, chocolate cake cookies are natural to us. God is not natural to us. We gotta think. We gotta have the Chachma Bina Das, the wisdom, understanding, and knowledge about God. From there, we have to work on getting it to our emotions, and then from there, ultimately, we'll get to our actions. So let's try. We'll do a quick look at what would this actually look like. Give practical steps. I'm talking in theory, right? Want to get a little bit concrete. Let's talk a little concrete. So let's say, for example, you start off, we just celebrated Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah is a great time to think about God's kingship. God is king over the world. He controls everything. He rules over everything. It can create within you a certain level of awe. Okay? You have awe, and therefore, when you feel the awe, you don't want to go against him. The only way you can do something that God doesn't like is if you either, right? Think about it like this. I'm sure everybody's been to synagogue, right? You've ever been awe-inspired by God and you feel like you want to do everything for God. So how do we suddenly go home and do whatever it is that we normally do, right? And suddenly do things that we know are clearly against God. There's a couple ways we do it. One way is we push away those feelings, we ignore it, and we think about something else. We don't feel guilty. You say, well, yeah, I really love God, but this is really fun. Let me just, put that aside. The bacon is really tasty, or whatever else it is. The shrimp is really good. You have to put aside those feelings towards God. Sometimes, though, you can actually be doing something wrong and feel very guilty. It's kind of it's a war going on inside of you, exactly as we're describing here in the Tanya, the godly soul, the animalistic soul. Another way is to convince yourself you're not doing something wrong, to convince yourself this is what God would want, right? But in theory, if your heart was full of feelings towards God, I'm sorry, yeah, I'm moving the screen a lot. In theory, if your heart was full of feelings towards God, how can you do anything against him? Similarly, love towards God. If you were to think about, contemplate seriously, take even 5 minutes. We would never. How many times do we do this? Let's say you take 5 minutes of your day, and you think about how everything in your life is coming from God. Everything that you have, your health, your family, your wealth, whatever it is that you have in life is coming from him. How could you not be full of love towards God? And if you're not, maybe you haven't thought about it enough, right? But once you get that feeling towards God, you're going to want to do something for him, right? This is in general why emotions is a primary driver for a lot of what we do. And we need to awaken those emotions through the mind. Now, once you have the emotions, once you have the intellect, once you have the emotions, then finally you get to the action. One thing the Alter Rebbe is going to add here, a very fascinating point, is that, as I mentioned last time, the animalistic soul is naturally more hyper. The animalistic soul is naturally more energized. And therefore, he says, when you awaken the love of God in the right side of your heart, which is where the godly soul is, eventually can spill over into the left side of your heart where the animalistic soul is. And as I mentioned, that the animalistic soul is not necessarily evil, it's just animalistic. Okay, so let's take a look here at some Tanya. We'll be on page 115. So it's kind of in the middle of what we were discussing last week. Again, this was about the war between the animalistic soul and the godly soul, and what happens when the godly soul takes over. So now he's going to describe. And so he's now going to describe, what does it look like a hostile takeover by the godly soul? It's not hostile, it's an important takeover. So what does a takeover by the godly soul look like? It looks like this. Since the mind ultimately controls everything, this means the three faculties of your brain dealing with inquiry, cognition, and recognition, or as I call them, wisdom, understanding, and knowledge, should be influenced entirely by the Chachma, Bina, and Das of your divine soul. Let's take a look over here at the practical lesson. This just points out what I've been saying here. Your divine soul and animal pleasure-seeking soul are both competing for control over your body. The way to ensure that the divine soul wins is by meditating about God, using the techniques described in the Tanya, so that your heart will become saturated with love for God. I like that word, saturated. You want to get to the point of saturation, okay? Because that's where you're going to see the magic. Again, as I keep saying, and I'll say it many, many times, it's very, very, it's very easy to love chocolate cake, but it's very hard to feel love towards God, and you need to saturate yourself with it. And so if you are wondering in your life, why are you not feeling feelings towards God? Maybe you're not saturating your life enough with understanding of God. This is why in Hasidic circles, davening takes so long to saturate yourself, or I should say the preparation for davening. Before davening, they would sit and study Hasidic philosophy to saturate yourself, and that creates the love of God. See, so let's look at this. Practically, this means, as we have discussed in chapter 3, the focus on the intellectual inquiry of God and the cognition of these ideas let's move in closer. By pondering his unfathomable, endless greatness, which through recognition will lead to reverence in your mind and trepidation of God in your heart. So he's pointing out that when you focus on his unfathomable greatness, it can lead to reverence and trepidation. And then he continues. And from the mind to the heart, a love of God like a fire burning in your heart, like a flaming fire, so that your soul will yearn indeed towards languish with fervent desire to attach yourself to the blessed infinite light with all your heart, soul, and might. A flaming fire is a great description. King Solomon, in his famous book, the Book of Song of Songs, describes the love that we should have towards God as the love between two lovers, between a man and a woman. Why? Because that's really what it should look like. That passionate love, that passionate desire should exist between us and God. And that's called a flaming fire, right? The heart beating and to the point where you can't think of anything else. Maimonides even describes it. When you love someone to that point, nothing can get in your way. You can't think of anything else. You're all disturbed and you cannot, what they say when you're in love, right? So when you're in love with God, that's the only thing that matters to you. And so anything that stands in the way becomes not an obstacle, because you have that flaming fire and desire towards God. If we could have a flaming fire and desire towards God, I mean, my gosh, I think we'd be doing really well. We wouldn't have all the struggles that we'd have. There would be nothing to stop us. We'd be unstoppable. Now, the reality is most of us will not be able to maintain such a level of love towards God. That's why we're not tzaddikim over here. But we can do it sometimes, and it will definitely help us in our battle towards doing the right thing. So again, what am I saying? I'm saying that the more often we can create this flaming fire towards God, even if it doesn't last very long, the fact that you felt those feelings once gives you a holdover to stand strong in certain areas of your life. For example, the same thing is with love. I was talking to someone. They were telling me they were married to someone for many, many years. That really in love, whatever. And unfortunately, the last couple of years of their marriage, it fell apart. But he was telling me he worked so hard on it because of all those years. So the moment it falls apart, you don't right away break it off. You try and make it work because you know that there is something there. And similarly with God, even if we're not feeling that flaming fire right now, we only felt it a couple hours ago in the morning. That flaming fire of love towards God can remind us when we're faced with decisions about what we really hold dear, what we really hold important, who we really love. Even if I'm not feeling it at the moment, if I were feeling it, I probably wouldn't have any battle going on, right? There's no battle when there's a flaming fire. It totally overwhelms you. That's what he's going to describe in a moment. When the godly soul is able to awaken a flaming fire, you're totally overwhelmed by love towards God. There's no other thought of anything else. But for most of us, it subsides. And then we're faced with the challenges that we face in our life. So here's going to describe what it looks like in Tanya again when you're overwhelmed. It says like this. She says, this meditation is aimed at reverence and love emanating from the depths of the heart, from its right chamber where the divine soul's emotions emerge. The experience should be so intense. The right chamber is inlaid with love. That's from Song of Songs, filled to the capacity and overflowing. so that the love spills over into the left side of the heart to the center of the animal soul. So this is exactly what it's describing. When you are in that moment of a flaming fire, we've described there's a war of godly soul, animal soul. The animal soul has nowhere to be. He's overwhelmed by the godly soul. Unfortunately, we have it sometimes the other way, where the animalistic soul with its flaming desires overwhelms the godly soul. That happens too. But here we're discussing the positive for now, is that you can get to a point. Again, I'm saying for most of us, it doesn't happen very often. But when it happens, there's that moment. It may happen on Yom Kippur for 5 minutes. It may happen on Rosh Hashanah for 5 minutes, when you have that flaming desire towards God. And as he ends up, the effect of this love will be to subdue the Sitra Achra, that's the darker side, and its negative elements of water, the source of lust, and desire for kosher pleasures from the Klipas Noga. Remember, he says kosher pleasures, right? We discussed in previous chapters, even kosher pleasures can be a problem. So if we allow our godly soul to overwhelm us and overwhelm our systems, serving God becomes easy. Think about it like this. Sometimes we do mitzvahs, we feel we have to. Sometimes for some people it's fasts. For some people it's or certain elements of Shabbat seem very difficult. So again, I'm going to make this practical. So again, number one, as I said, we should get every once in a while into that overwhelming state of overwhelming love. Okay, that's going to help us in general. We recall that love that we had, and that helps us in general. And so the more often we can awaken that love, even though it doesn't last, that will help us throughout our day. Number two is, even if we cannot get to an overwhelming level of love, any level of love towards God is going to make your service of God easier, right? In other words, we should enjoy serving God. We should enjoy serving God. In other words, you can go your entire life serving God because you're scared of him. You can go your entire life serving God because you grew up that way. You can go your entire life serving God in a way where you feel forced for whatever reason. But that's not fun. It's not exciting, and it doesn't change who you are. In other words, you really, really want to do other things, but you're left doing this thing. I think I've discussed this another time. There was there's a lot of, people are addicted to cigarettes. There's a lot of different ways that people get unaddicted to cigarettes, but many of them actually have to do with getting the people to not enjoy the cigarette anymore. Okay. In other words, to give up smoking, one of the ways is by making smoking seem unappealing, right? So sometimes they put, really stinky stuff in the cigarette. There are books that play mind games. There are all different ways that they do this. Right, it's one of the methods that they do. It's very hard to do something when you don't enjoy it. Right, it's very hard to do something when you don't enjoy it, and you don't want to go your whole life feeling like you're denying yourself. You want to enjoy what you're doing. It's very hard to keep Shabbat feeling that you're denying yourself of a wonderful Saturday out with friends and washing your car and cutting your grass or whatever else. I don't know what people do on Saturday, but it's very hard to go a whole Shabbat. It's very hard to go a whole Yom Kippur just feeling you're denying yourself of food without any other feeling of the enjoyment of it. I know a lot of families where they they don't keep a lot, but Yom Kippur they fast, and their kids sometimes, some of them appreciate the fast, but some of them feel like, what are we doing? Like, we don't do anything else the whole year, and suddenly, one day a year, you're just making us, fast for what? If they get the context of it, that's good. But if they're not getting any context, then so don't eat anything, right? It's Yom Kippur, you can't eat, right? That's not a Yom Kippur that they're going to want, right? Same thing with Shabbos. There was once they tell the story that back in America in the 1920s and 30s, it was very hard to keep Shabbos, and people who keep Shabbos, the jobs were open on Saturday, they would lose their job every week. So there were two families where they kept Shabbos, but unfortunately, one of the families, all their kids ended up continuing the tradition of keeping Shabbos. The other one all dropped it. So the one whose kids dropped it asked, what's the difference between me and you? Whether it's a real story or not, I don't know, but the point is true. He says, when you sit down Friday night, what do you say with your family? He says, well, I sit down and say, oh, it's so hard to be a Jew, right? And he says, that's your problem. He says, when I would sit down and say, Baruch Hashem, I get to celebrate Shabbos. All right, so I lost my job. In other words, that's the idea. So you can do the same thing. But the one father kept saying, it's so hard to be Jewish. I keep losing my job. So hard to do this. Or you can say, I'm so excited and happy that I can give up something for my Judaism. And that's what the kids want to hear. That's what will continue for the kids. And that's what will continue for ourselves. So similarly with us, it's nice to talk about the kids. Let's talk about ourselves. If we want to enjoy Judaism, it requires the mind. It requires the mind. So this is why we've been discussing the whole Tanya. Don't allow yourself to have lazy faith. Don't allow yourself to have lazy mitzvahs, lazy actions. The more you study about the mitzvahs, the more you study about God, the more you study about Judaism, the more you can appreciate God, Judaism, the mitzvahs that you do, and the easier and more enjoyable they will be to do. And not only that, more success you will have in doing them. Okay. Let's continue. Now he's going to just describe this love towards God a little bit more. I feel like I'm talking a lot, but then again, I'm a rabbi, so maybe that's what we do. So here he's going to describe what would happen if you were able to give yourself such a high level of love towards God to the point where you could transform your animalistic soul. And in transformation of the animalistic soul, there's two levels. One is called iskafia, that means subduing, and one is called hishapcha, transforming it. Okay, I'll say that again. Iskafia means to subdue, and hishapcha means to transform. In other words, I can either subdue the darker side of myself. I can subdue it for a time. Of course, when I'm done with my excitement and love towards God, it comes back. Or I can transform my darker side. Now, transformation on a whole will not happen for most of us. It can happen in a small level. But for the most part, we subjugate the darker side. We can transform it to an extent, but a full transformation happens only for a tzaddik, for righteous people. That's why righteous people don't really run after chocolate cake. Let's continue. We should initially seek to tame our darker side, though in some cases it can be healed completely. These two phases are known as iskafia, subduing negativity, and hishapcha, transforming it completely. And now he's going to describe transformation. The love from the right side ought to be so powerful that it not only changes, but ultimately transforms the left side from seeking worldly pleasures to love God. Throughout the Tanya, several experiences of love of God are described, each offering in character and intensity. The above thoughts are aimed at producing experiences known as love of flaming fire. This is sufficient to tame the animal soul, but not to transform it. Full transformation requires a more intense experience of love, to which the Tanya will now turn. It's interesting just to point out there's a quote that a lot of people have in their Jewish libraries. It's from a medrash somewhere, I believe, and it says basically like this: if people only knew the pleasure of studying Torah, the deep pleasure of studying the depths of the Torah, they would leave all the other pleasures, because this is the most intense and most beautiful and enjoyable pleasure. So it's an interesting thought. The more we can appreciate Torah study, the less we're running after the other things. So he says like this: as it is written, you should love God with all your heart. So with all your heart implies not just the part of your heart which has the godly soul, but the part of your heart that has the animalistic soul as well. As the term lavav, rather than contracted from lev, suggests the presence of two elements of the heart, leading the sages teach you should love God with both your impulses. I'm not going to get into details, technicality of Jewish grammar, but the point is, the Talmud says you should love God with both sides of yourself, meaning both the Yetzer Tov, the impulse to good, and the Yetzer Hara, the impulse to do evil. This is a state where the Yetzer Hara has been transformed to good. The animal soul just wants whatever is deemed to be good for itself, physical pleasures, which are tangible and easily experienced, which naturally allure the animal soul, but it could also be drawn to higher pleasures, such as meditating on God and feeling His presence. This is the transformation of Yetzer Hara to Yetzer Tov, which the sages prefer. I'm going to ask you all a question in a moment, but let's finish this line. This happens when you elevate yourself and eventually reach the level of great love, which is more powerful than the term of endearment, than the level of strong love like flaming fire. As we have seen, love like flaming fire represents a yearning and languishing of the soul i.e., a desire to come close to something distant. Great love, on the other hand, is experienced of closeness to God. We actually feel and enjoy His presence as something up close. So again, you can have two types of love. One is a desire to get closer to God when He's far, or there's a great love, but you feel when He's closer. It's not for now because we're both, we'll discuss later in Tanya. So here's my question to all of you. Have you ever experienced a moment in which your feelings towards God or Judaism or something was to the point where even though something was difficult, it was not there was no question. In other words, not because you grew up that way. You had a feeling towards a feeling towards Judaism that made you feel like there's no question, this is what I want to do. Just an example. Some people Yom Kippur. Yes, you're hungry, but you don't feel like you want to eat. You're enjoying the Day of Atonement. I know it sounds funny, but I personally enjoy Yom Kippur. I enjoy that, the hunger feeling really actually enhances the Yom Kippur. It's possible, my point is, it's possible in our lives that things that are not natural to us can become natural through the right conditioning. I wonder if anybody can share something just to help bring this home, this whole idea, because that's the whole point of this class, to bring out when your emotions, when you're when your emotions towards God's or your emotion towards a certain mitzvah make something that's difficult feel enjoyable. And the reason I'm saying this is because if that is true of a certain element of your life, you can do it in other areas of life. In other words, there are the areas we find easier, the areas we find harder. And so, yes, Adam.
Yeah. So in my business, I view my job, I guess, as service. It's service to God, it's service to my community, service to myself. And there are times where I'm dealing with the client, whereas the client is not communicating. So I take it upon myself to reach out, whereas my superior might say, no, wait, let them call you.
Mm-hmm.
Let them reach out to you and wait. And yet in my business, waiting is not a good thing. So It's almost to me like I'm right and I shouldn't do what my boss tells me to do because I'm really serving my community, my God, and myself. And something like that takes over. And
well, I actually thought you were going to go a different direction. The type of work that you do is not, shall I say, the typical, what a lot of people wouldn't want to do, right? Being a funeral director.
Yeah.
However, because you appreciate the respect for the deceased, the respect for the family, although probably in the beginning it was uncomfortable, once you appreciate it, it's not difficult anymore.
Right. It has
you feel you're
purpose.
serving. That's what I thought you were going to say. You're serving the family, you're serving the person that's passed, and you can come to respect that work and the job that you're doing, even though it's naturally a more difficult one. People don't like to face
Yeah.
and things like that.
Yeah. And then the manager
So
tells
I just know for me, right, as a rabbi, we've done a tahara before, right? It's not natural for me to enjoy doing a tahara,
Yeah.
right? I shouldn't say ever enjoy because we don't like people to pass away, but when you appreciate the meaning behind a tahara, the purification that someone gets, and you connect with that mitzvah, then you can deal with it. Yeah.
Yes, I am, David.
Yes, he is a funeral director. Yep.
And a Jewish one at that.
Yes, Jewish funeral director. We did a tahara, and like I said, it's not natural, but once you come to appreciate it, you can do it. Anybody else? Any thoughts?
Rabbi, would you mind repeating the question, but maybe in 2 sentences?
Okay, great question. What is something, I'll go with Jewishly if possible, something Jewish that is naturally difficult that you enjoy and do because you found meaning? You've been
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Maybe. Okay. Actually, maybe Yom Kippur actually is a good example. I don't know how others feel, but you know, there's I don't midway, at least for me, midway through the day, like at 3 or 4 o'clock, there's like a turning point where at least, at least where I stop craving food and drink, and I revel in the fact that I'm winning and over the animal soul, and that I know I'm going to make it, and you kind of feel the hand of God uh, supporting you, or you feel your godly soul supporting you.
Good, good. Yeah, it's a good example. And my point with these examples is think about an area of our life where we've come to enjoy something that's not natural to us, and maybe think we can apply it in other areas and other struggles that you have. That's going to be the best practice for winning. So if you're having a struggle in some area of your Judaism, try to think of ways to start with the mind, to get to the heart, to get to the action. And that will be the best. Don't just tell yourself, well, I really should be doing it, right? We have a lot of guilt, right? We're Jews, we have a lot of guilt. So a lot of times we tell ourselves, well, I really should do X, Y, and Z. Well, maybe yes, maybe you really should, but you're struggling. Face the fact that you're struggling. And if you want to, and remember, as we've discussed in Tanya, you've got the godly soul, animalistic soul. So that means your animalistic soul has a good footing here. If you want to be able to conquer that animalistic soul, go back to the drawing board, study about it, create feelings towards it, and then move ahead with it. And that will be the best way. I'm not saying wait till you get there, but that will be the best way. So let's say a lot of people suffer with this. Davening is very difficult for a lot of people. It's long for some people, and it's hard to find meaning in the words. Well, maybe it requires a study of prayer. What prayer means, what prayer does, and study the specific prayers. Don't just give up on it or say, well, this is a struggle for me, so I'm just not going to do it. Tanya tells us, well, you have a struggle because you have an animalistic soul. That's natural. And so in every area of our Judaism, wherever we're having a struggle, obviously you can't fight all fronts at once, but try to, navigate the different fronts, what you want to tackle. And don't just tell yourself, well, I have to do it. I mean, you can do that, but a long-term success strategy is to be able to create positive feelings towards it. How do you create positive feelings towards it? Is by using the mind to unlock those positive feelings. Anybody else has any other example where they've kind of found a mitzvah that once was difficult for them, but they have been able to come to a positive feeling towards it that enables them to overcome that challenge? Any other thoughts? No, we're all quiet.
Well, I don't know. We've used this example already, but it's true for me as Yom Kippur. It really was a much more difficult day than it used to be, and I would say that in general about some of the longer davenings. I would sort of get tired after not all that long. A couple hours maybe would be more than enough. But I don't know. The time goes by. It's not that big of a deal. Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, really any of them. So I think for me it's the more context and the more sort of consistency of behavior. Like the Rosh Hashanah service, for example, didn't have any sort of I had no sense for it, but really it's an expanded version of what's on Shabbos or other times. It kind of fits within the same structure, and so that helped me because
I see. You're saying before it used to be just Shabbos was this amount of words and Rosh Hashanah was this amount of words, but once you appreciated the structure of and what it's trying to build up, then the structure of the prayers of Rosh Hashanah, which are very structured, by the way. Rosh Hashanah prayers are very structured.
right.
It doesn't feel so long anymore.
Right. And it makes more sense too,
right?
Which at least for me is important because I don't know, I just seem to do better, in those kinds of situations where I sort of understand the structure of things.
Good. I like it. Thank you. Anybody else wants to chime in? And again, my point here is that take this and apply it in other areas where you're struggling, because that's the key. Remember, the war of the godly soul and animalistic soul, allow the godly soul the place. I used to feel sick and even fainted during the fast of Yom Kippur. Now it's so much easier. Okay. Yeah. Well, when I was a kid, I never fainted, but yeah, it used to be a lot harder. It also helps to eat well before the fast. But oh yeah, as a side note, anybody who drinks a lot of coffee, you might want to start tapering your coffee now. Before Yom Kippur. Okay. So let's go on. We'll move on unless anybody else has anything else to share, which I'd love to hear. But let's continue. I think there's some text I want to get to over here. Let's take a look here. Okay. Then he just discusses okay. He says he just describes it in scripture. This great love is referred to as pleasurable love, which is to take pleasure in God. He says over here like this, a Hasidic thought: I can tackle the negative indirectly by focusing on the positive. If my divine soul will generate enough love for God, it will overflow into the domain of the animalistic soul. That's something we've said many times, right? Don't not think about the pink elephant, but think about the green elephant. So since we have just two powers within us, the godly soul, animalistic soul, if you can bring the positive, the negative should fall away to an extent. The love of flaming fire represents the intense desire to connect to God, who remains distant. It expresses itself in will, a yearning to follow the ways of God, even though you are still drawn to the pleasures of this world. Your passion is for a higher, more beautiful way of Torah life. It's an interesting thing. You can still be drawn to the passions of this world, but the flaming fire doesn't let you think about them. It's like I mentioned earlier, right? Like the person who's in love, right? A love of two lovers. Doesn't mean they don't like anything else, but at this moment, they're engulfed by that love and flaming fire. So similarly, let's say Yom Kippur, if we want to bring an example, I can still like food, but I'm overwhelmed by the experience of Yom Kippur that the food is not bothering me right now. A pleasurable love represents the joy of already being connected to God. In this sense, it resembles the love you have for yourself. When you love yourself, there is no tempest, fiery yearning to be drawn to another person who is separate from you. You just take pleasure in yourself. This is an interesting differentiation he discusses later on in Tanya, that basically a flaming love is when you haven't gotten something yet, right? That's why generally you'll see two lovers when they're courting each other is when you'll see the most quote unquote love, or what some people might call infatuation. Once they're married, now I'm not getting into to all the jokes about marriage, but a deep love does not have to express itself in that what happens before when they're courting each other, and they're totally obsessed and they can't think of anything. At this level of pleasurable love for God, you have neutralized your desires for worldly pleasure and sin, and even the animal soul desires only God. Your love of God is what is the love of physical pleasures. It's for most people natural and organic. Most of us are not reaching that. Okay. Or at least not generally. It is a foretaste of the world that is coming. Pleasurable love resembles the experience of the future world that is coming, where an intimacy with God will be felt as part of ordinary life. So when Mashiach comes, you will enjoy God like you enjoy chocolate cake. He'll be the most pleasurable thing, So there really won't be any choice anymore. Once you get to that point, God is the most tasty thing, and nothing else is tasty at all. He says, this delight is experienced in the mental faculties of inquiry and intelligence by the sheer pleasure of understanding God and knowing him, according to the limit of your intellectual grasp and vision. In contrast to love like a flaming fire, which is experienced primarily in the heart, pleasurable love is a strong mental component. This is because it is from the element of water. I'm going to skip because this is going to complicate everybody. And he just reads in the seed, the sown light is within the divine souls. Okay. I'll read this paragraph. Hopefully it won't confuse people too much. Probing deeper into the psyche, the Tanya here draws on the Kabbalistic description of man's origins. But if people want to know more about Kabbalistic ideas, JLI is having a course. We're doing a course right after Sukkot called Kabbalah. We'll discuss Kabbalah, 6-week course. But anyways, the Tanya here draws on the Kabbalistic description of man's origin, commenting on the fivefold mention of light on the first day of creation and water in the second, right? Light was created on the first day of creation, water was on the second. The Zohar notes, when a person comes to be, He is first seed, which is light. For that seed is the light of all the limbs of the body. Afterwards, that seed, which is light, spreads and becomes water. So again, this is a quote from the Zohar. By the moisture of the water, it becomes further detailed, and the form of the body expands into these waters, growing in all directions. Since light, seed precedes water in order of creation, through accessing the higher power of light in the divine soul, you're capable of transforming the water of the animal soul for good. So this is basically this is what I always point out, an interesting thing. The Kabbalah is almost like what I say science is to the world, right? Science basically explains you why things are happening, right? Why do flowers grow when water and sun hits it? And so the science explains to you what happens with the photosynthesis. Okay, I'm not going to try again. What happens when a flower grows, right? It gives you the science behind it, right? We know you pour water on it. We know that the sun hits it and it'll grow, right? Now we get the scientific understanding behind it. Similarly, he's saying over here, we know and understand that if we can access the light of our soul, we can overcome our worldly pleasures. The Zohar, the Kabbalah, gives us the Kabbalistic understanding behind that, the Kabbalistic science, if you want to say behind it. What's the Kabbalistic science? Is that light precedes water in creation. Therefore, if you can access light, you can control your water. We explained earlier that water is the source of all temptation and pleasure. Water is really, the basis of anything that we enjoy, right? Eat dust, doesn't taste very good, right? You mix water into anything. Everything needs water or oil, right? To give it the moisture that we enjoy in it. But light in creation comes before water. Therefore, the Kabbalah is telling us, why does it work if you access the light of your soul, that you can overcome the worldly pleasures? It's because in creation, light comes before water. So again, just an interesting thing, where Kabbalah is like the science of the world. I really enjoy these things, honestly. It's a very interesting thing. A lot of times people are like, what is the Kabbalah saying? When you frame it the right way, when you understand Kabbalah in the right way, it becomes a very fascinating subject and very interesting. It's telling you the scientific, spiritual makeup of what we're looking at over here. But anyways, that is a side point. It's not really the main part of the Tanya. Let's continue. He says like this. The divine soul's sown light transforms the sources of all desires for pleasures of this world, the element of water and the animal soul to good. Right? So the light can transform the element of water and animal soul to good, as it is written in Eitz Chaim, section 50, chapter 3, citing the Zohar, that the impulse to evil can be transformed into pure good itself. The impulse to evil is not irredeemably evil. It is simply a force of desire. By training it to appreciate the great pleasure of immersing in godly wisdom, it can be transformed to naturally desire only good. That's why we're saying, when you actually enjoy fasting in Yom Kippur, it's possible that even your animalistic soul is enjoying, right? Just as I've said many times, an animalistic soul can come to enjoy a diet. Some people, they actually, I meet like these very healthy people, right? They can literally look at a non-organic food and like seems disgusting to them, right? Similarly, I look at a cheeseburger, it looks disgusting to me. Some people apparently like it. Now, I didn't work hard on it. I was born not eating them, okay? And whenever I see it, it just looks horrible, okay? Or shrimp or lobster or all that stuff. I really am not. Does that mean that, wow, I'm so righteous? No, I grew up that way, and my animalistic soul is kind of trained that way. So my animalistic soul, puts its desires in other areas. Okay. So again, that's what we're saying. The animal soul is not evil. Here, look at the practical lessons. The animal soul is not evil. It just has crude tastes. Through meditation and the study of Hasidic wisdom, you can teach your animal soul to appreciate sacred and spiritual things too. If this art is perfected, it is possible to completely eliminate the lustful desires of the animal soul and transform them into spiritual yearnings. But that doesn't mean you've given up on the pleasures of life. You've replaced them with even greater pleasures. I'm going to read that last line because it's important. That doesn't mean you've given up on the pleasures of life. You've replaced them with even greater pleasures. So people sometimes look at very religious people and wonder, what are they giving up? What good life are they giving up? They're not giving up anything. They enjoy their life. They don't feel they're denying themselves. Often every once in a while, every couple of years, they make these movies about these ex-Orthodox people. Now, obviously, there's some communities which are very toxic, but some of these people that I watch and I see them talk, and they're describing, all the things they were denied because they were in an Orthodox community. It's, to me, I just see it as they didn't appreciate it. In other words, again, I'm not talking about there's toxicity as well. Every community has toxicity, but my point is that sometimes they just never really grabbed onto that lifestyle, and therefore they felt they were denying themselves of something in this world. But if you really appreciate that lifestyle, you don't feel like you're denying yourself. And here's the interesting thing: you can't have both, right? Because the religious lifestyle is its own set of lifestyle. You can't really mix the two. It won't really work. You can't, certain pleasures of the world don't go along with a religious lifestyle. So if you really want that religious enjoyment in that life that you enjoy, and they're very happy people. You can meet many religious people. Again, I'm not saying there aren't those who aren't happy, and there are many that have had many issues in communities, and I'm not getting into that. This is a point about specific cases. Okay, it's a lifestyle, and if you're on the outside of the lifestyle, you look at it and you say, well, how are they enjoying? Like, aren't they denying this? What are they missing? But when you place it in context, they hopefully, they've come to a point where they appreciate it. So myself personally, right? So Shabbat's a great example, of course. I don't feel I'm denying myself anything on Shabbat. I think it's the best thing. I don't even know how I would live without Shabbat. I mean, many people say the same thing, but someone on the outside, like, they don't know, like, what would you do if you didn't have, Saturday off to do whatever it is that you want to do? Does that mean Shabbat is never difficult for me? No, it doesn't mean it's never difficult, but on a whole, I've replaced, that pleasure, whatever the pleasure would have been on Saturday, is for Shabbat. All right, so let's look at this. Many people Shabbat, they want, they go to concerts, or they go to movies, or they go to whatever it is. And I enjoy my Shabbat personally. In a similar fashion to an addict who cannot embrace, how did Esmeralda and Robert get in the same place? Okay. In a similar fashion to an addict who cannot embrace a new life until he has rid himself of self-destructive behavior patterns, the animal soul cannot be drawn to the more subtle pleasures of godly wisdom unless it is first divests itself from its past habits of worldly pleasures. It's an important line. The animal soul, to truly appreciate godly things, has to let go of some of its worldly pleasures. And this is the key to what Tanya is going to discuss, is that, as the old saying goes, you can't have your cake and eat it too. We have to give up something to get something. If we want to come to a place where we truly appreciate and love God, automatically that means we're giving up on some of our physical desires. And honestly, anything where you're not giving up, it's not worth getting, right? If you don't have to give up anything, right? The athlete, you don't become a world-class athlete without giving up on other things. You don't become a world-class scholar without giving up on some pleasures. Anything worth it in life requires work, requires giving up on other things. And the same thing applies in our service of God, is that if we truly want to feel God, we are automatically giving up on some of the worldly pleasures as we go ahead with that. And I think he just continues along discussing the war, which we're gonna get into. I think it's 12:55. So I'm not going to do that, but just a note over here when he says removing the soiled garments, that refers to the garments of thought, speech, and action of the animalistic soul, right? And when we serve God and we love God, we take off that clothing. And he's going to describe in the next page that when the godly soul overcomes, it rules not only it rules over your thought, speech, and action. And then he continues here. It rules over the emotions in the heart. It rules over thought, speech, and action. And it rules over 248 limbs of your body. Okay, we'll have to do that quickly next week. You get the idea. Point is, if we can reach a point where our godly soul is in control, then it will control all parts of us. And the trick to get there is by using our intellect, going to our emotions, going to our action. And again, as I said today, the practical takeaway today is that in your life, think about a part of Judaism that's difficult for you, and using your intellect, then to your emotions, try and overcome that obstacle. And that's the way to do it, number one. Number two is that a lot of times we will have to give up something. I spoke about this on Rosh Hashanah as well. You have to go out of your comfort zone. If you're not willing to give up anything, you can't get anywhere. As I think there's 12-step groups they talk about, right? If nothing changes, nothing changes. One of their great lines. They say, if nothing changes, nothing changes. If nothing changes, nothing changes. If you're hoping to do better at your Judaism without changing any other part of your life, I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but it's not going to work. Something has to change in order to change. I just want to give one description of someone who was so desiring of God. That the story is not that important. We'll discuss another time. But okay, we'll have to pick up next week. So thank you all for coming, and we'll end off with that. I think it's a good ending point. It's hitting 1 o'clock. And next week I may not be able to make it because I think I have to see. I think there was something, if I recall, just giving you a heads up. So if I won't be able to make it, I'll text the night before to let you know.
Well, we'll see you the night before.
Oh, I know what's happening. The county, I need to meet with the county about the new building. You will see me the night before, that's true. I need to meet with the county, and I think they're giving us a morning appointment, and I'm not sure how long it'll go. So I have to see about that, but I need to meet with the county about the new building. So that's what's going on next Tuesday.